Today's video, we're changing axles in the DD2. Welcome back to the Power Republic YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be showing you how to change the axle in the DD2. Now this is very similar to changing axles in most other go-karts, 30mm, 50mm. Right here we've got the 40mm, and also too, we have axle clamps that we're going to have to sort of take off, and I want to show you guys how to get it done. So let's get to it. Thanks to everyone that has subscribed already and turned on the notifications. If you like the video, please consider giving us a thumbs up. It really means a lot. So you can see here on our demo kart that we've already got the wheels and tires removed. So that's obviously the first thing you're going to do. Take your wheels off, take your hubs off, or just slip the hub straight off the axle. Next up, we're going to start removing all the screws. And the first one we're going to start with is the axle grub screws. The first thing you're going to want to do is just loosen off the grub screws with your Allen key. And then you can just spin them out like so. Now I like to take my grub screws all the way out, so one, they don't fall down in the dirt, and two, I can guarantee that they're not touching the axle. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the axle drive coupling. So you can see here, this is the axle drive coupling for the DD2. There's a spline here on the output shaft of the gearbox of the DD2, and this will just slide over the top, and that's what transmits the drive to the axle. So we've got to loosen all these bolts off and slide that off, and we've also got to slide this one off. So the first thing we're going to do is undo this Allen key with the 5mm T-bar. And then you can just slide that along the axle. So the next thing we're going to do is get our 4mm Allen key and just loosen off all these bolts. Now as you can see, the nylock nuts are captive inside the housing here, and we just have to keep backing the nuts off ever so slowly, like so, because you do have to do this up really tight. So if you've got a power drill, now's the time to use it. The next thing we're going to undo is the brake disc carrier. Now we're going to use a 6mm T-bar, and then we're going to wedge it open with a screwdriver. So the first thing we're going to do is loosen this screw off with the Allen key, then just spin it back a couple of turns. Now that we've loosened off all the hardware, it's time to take out the axle. So grab yourself a big yellow screwdriver and gently tap it into the brake disc carrier. Then grab yourself a big zip tie, chuck it down here through the front crash bar, and we're going to zip tie the brake pedal on, and that's going to hold our brake disc nice and firm with the rear brake pads. And then we're going to get our 40mm axle basher, slide that in, and tap the axle out through the engine side. As you can see, the drive coupling is still hard up on the engine. So what I'm going to do is just tap the axle back a fraction and get that off, just like so. Once you've got the drive coupling away from the engine, you can slide it on the axle. And these are the little guys that go between the axle and your drive coupling. Don't forget to remove your axle keyway once it's free of the brake disc carrier. So you can see the axle basher comes all the way through the brake disc and holds everything. So you can slide this back and then just slide the axle out through the engine side. Remove the axle collars. So now you can just pull the axle out. So now that we've got the axle out of the cart and we want to change it, we select the axle we want, and this is how you put it back in. So simply clean the axle, add a little bit of lubrication, and then slide it in through the engine. Reinstall your axle bushings. Slide your drive coupling on. Slide the axle back onto the axle basher. Slide the axle basher into the axle. This guy can go across. Push the axle back through the brake hub. Once the axle's back in the bearing, you can remove the axle basher and go around to the other side. Now, as you are hitting the axle across the car, you've got to make sure that the keyway lines back up with the brake disc hub and that you remember to put the keyway back in. So now if you get yourself a set square, you can put it on the end of the axle and you can measure back to the chassis rail. And this one here is 199 millimeters. And you can see this one here is 222 millimeters. So we're going to have to halve that and it's going to be approximately 210. So we've got to go across about 10 millimeters. And you can see that there's perfect both sides. The next thing I like to do is reinstall the grub screws. But before that, we put Loctite on them so they don't come loose. So a tiny dab of Loctite on each one. Reinstall your grub screw. The next thing I like to do is release the brakes and rotate the axle so I can line up the grub screws with the old grub screw holes in the axle. So what I like to do is hold the bearing with the Allen key in the grub screw, and then I can rotate the axle to find the grub screw holes that line up with the 3 grub screws of the bearing. Yep, I'm just trying to find one. So now that we've got one of the holes lined up here, we're just going to check to make sure the other ones are lined up. So rotate the axle. There's another little grub screw indent there. So what I can do is just nip this one up and then reinstall the other 2 grub screws. Once you've got all the grub screws nipped up, you can go around and tighten them right up, super tight. So another thing I like to do, and this is a shout out to my friend Jason that came up with this suggestion, is add a 40mm axle collar to the axle. Now the reason to do that is the only thing that's stopping the axle from coming out of the go-kart is those 3 grub screws we put in. So we're going to put this one in on the other side of the bearing. It's going to be a little insurance policy to stop the axle moving in our go-kart. Remove the 2 cap screws and split the bearing collar in 2. Place the first half of the axle collar on the axle and then holding it with your finger, rotate it around. Drop 1 bolt on the ground as always, but in the meantime get yourself an Allen key and just screw that one in there first so it doesn't fall off. Pick up the other screw that you've dropped down in the dirt and put that in the other side, after cleaning it of course. The one thing to be mindful of when you're using these axle collars is to make sure the gap between the 2 halves is roughly the same. You can see here this one here is a little bit tighter, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen this screw off half a turn and do the other side up. Recheck that the gaps are pretty similar and then do the 2 screws up super tight. Next up, grab your 6mm Allen key and do up the brake disc hub. To help centralize the disc on the axle, pump the brake pedal a few times. Now you can do up your 6mm Allen key. Last but not least, we're going to reinstall the drive gear coupling. Slide these little guys over so they touch the engine. Roughly line up your axle gear coupling with the drive of the motor, and then you should just be able to jiggle that straight on, like so. Slide all the bolts back into so the nuts are in their little house, and you can do up all these screws. Yep. So, 3, 2, 1. Once you've roughly done those up, you can go back through and tighten each one individually, and you'll have to do this a couple of times. Right. On a race-ready go-kart, now's the time to reinstall the keyways, the axle hubs and the wheels. If you liked this video and you found it helpful, please give us a thumbs up, consider subscribing and turning on those pesky notifications. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Power Republic. You can go to our amazing website www.powerrepublic.com.au or even support us on Patreon. Thanks for watching, see you in the next video.